Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back to the second panel of the day, titled Trump and the War Against Radical Islamic Terrorism, Implications for the Region and the West. We have four distinguished experts who will be addressing this topic from their particular perspectives before we open up the floor to questions and discussions, and I will try to leave ample time for that. In February of this year, during his first speech to a joint session of Congress, President Trump said, his administration is, and I'm quoting now, taking steps to protect our nation from radical Islamic terrorism. Earlier, during his inauguration speech, he promised to eradicate what he described, again, as the threat of radical Islamic terrorism from the face of the earth, end of quote. For Trump and many of his supporters, the use of the phrase is tantamount to openly thumbing their noses at the Obama administration and also the Bush administration prior to that, which had scrupulously avoided using such incendiary language. Former President Barack Obama had in fact used the phrase violent extremism instead, refusing to implicate Islam as a whole in the commission of terrorist activities. Obama said at a CNN town hall in the fall that he was avoiding drawing a commonality between the tiny fraction of people with Muslim backgrounds who resort to militancy and the more than 1 billion peaceful Muslims around the world. And to drive this point home, Obama memorably commented, and I'm quoting him now, "If you had an organization that was going around killing and blowing people up and said, we're on the vanguard of Christianity, as a Christian," this is Obama speaking, "I'm not going to let them claim my religion and say, you're killing for Christ. I would say, that's ridiculous," end of quote. In contrast, Trump and many of his associates have explicitly asserted that the West is at war with Islam. While on the campaign trail last September in Florida, Trump stated, quoting, "We cannot let this evil continue, nor can we let the hateful ideology of radical Islam be allowed to reside or spread within our country." And he added, "Anyone who cannot name our enemy is not fit to lead this country," end of quote. Interestingly, by reveling in using the provocative phrase radical Islamic terrorism, Trump has gone against the advice of his own national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, who had specifically asked him to avoid using the term during his speech to Congress. McMaster's argument is that terrorists, like members of ISIS, are not representative of Islam and Muslims, and that the term radical Islamic terrorism alienates the very Muslims that the U.S. needs to work with to defeat the ideology propelling groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So what is in a name? I would now like to turn to our panelists to hear their views on this topic, and I would like each of them to respond to the question: how should we assess the significance of this change in terminology on the part of the Trump administration and evaluate its both short-term and long-term policy implications? Unfortunately, one of our panelists had to withdraw, Dr. Qamar al-Huda. He was called to an emergency meeting at the State Department and had to decline. But we have three other panelists who are ready to answer this question. And our first speaker will be Wiliam McCants, who is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy and director of the project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Johns Hopkins University and has held various government and think tank positions related to Islam, the Middle East, and terrorism. And from 2000 to 2011, McCants served as a U.S. State Department senior advisor for countering violent extremism. He's also the author of the acclaimed book, The ISIS Apocalypse, The History, Strategy, and Doomsday Vision of the Islamic State, which was published in 2015. You do have fuller biographies in the program, so I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to each speaker. So without further delay, Dr. McCants.
Sure. When we do it from here or the podium?
I think that's fine.
Here's okay? Yeah, sure. All right. Thank you. And thank you very much for having us this morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you and on such a distinguished panel. Those of us who have worked on trying to diminish support for Al-Qaeda and for the Islamic State over the past 15 years watched the election campaign of Donald Trump with horror as he used the kind of language that in many ways repeated the talking points of those organizations whose support we were trying to diminish. The idea that Islam is implacably and inevitably incompatible with Western values, American values, the idea that Muslims are secret fifth columnists just waiting to rise up against the United States, the idea that Islam itself is inherently violent or radical. These are all messages being promulgated by groups that have been targeting the United States. So the fear of those of us who've worked on this from a counterterrorism perspective was that in many ways it's just feeding into their propaganda. And as Asma said, the prior two administrations, whatever their faults in terms of policy and politics, were very scrupulous in avoiding saying things that would play into the propaganda of America's enemies. President Bush and after him President Obama were careful in their language and understood that jihadist leaders like bin Laden and Zawahiri and others had written privately that they hoped the United States would play up the Islamic angle of Al-Qaeda, would use this kind of rhetoric in order to further drive a fissure between Muslims living in the West and the larger society. So when Donald Trump says on the campaign that Islam hates us, when people who would become appointed to his cabinet say that there should be a Sharia test for Muslim immigrants coming to this country, when he emphasizes radical Islamic terrorism rather than using more anodyne language, the worry of the counterterrorism community was that this would feed a very unhealthy story about the United States and its intentions. Now that the administration is in place, things have become a little more, let's say, charitably complicated. As Asma said in her opening remarks, the National Security Advisor, the current one, jettisoned the language of his predecessor, Michael Flynn, and is very wary of using terms like radical Islamic terrorism. This is a man who helped wage a counterinsurgency in Iraq. He worked shoulder to shoulder with Muslims in Iraq to try and bring safety and security to that country. If you go back and read his remarks from the time in 2006, 2007, he is very nuanced and careful about how he talks about these issues because he understands that in many parts of the world, combating this threat means, of course, working with Muslims who are the principal target of these organizations. So he has frowned on the use of this terminology, has urged the president not to use it. He has become a powerful voice in the administration. So that's the first thing to know, is that at the higher levels, this is not a settled debate. It's an ongoing debate. Among the civil servants that many of you in this room will probably be familiar with, there is a lot of reluctance to use this kind of terminology. They push back against it. They still want to use vague terms like countering violent extremism, which has its own problems, but nevertheless, they are continuing to think about the terminology issue in the same way that the prior administrations did. And these civil servants are vastly outweigh any of the ideologues who are in the administration. Part of the trouble for the ideologues is that the president has not been very successful in putting many of them in place. So they just don't have a lot of power throughout the executive branch. I would also say in private conversations with some of these war of idea types, they will tell you they themselves have become uncertain about the terminology. because now they're beginning to talk to law enforcement and hearing from law enforcement, local law enforcement, that this stuff is bad and counterproductive. And so some of them are also beginning to back off or think in more complicated ways about these things. That doesn't mean the radical Islamic terrorism language is going to go away anytime soon, but it's just to say that it's a lot more complicated on the inside at the moment than it appears from outside. In the same vein, the war of ideas as an organizing concept is also unsettled. No one knows what that means. Those of us on the outside who have asked have not gotten a good answer, but the people on the inside who are pushing it have not been able to really articulate what they mean by that. Some of them, based on their statements, you would suppose that war of ideas means going after the religion of Islam itself, but others are just say that no, it's mainly about promoting liberal values in the Middle East. It's really, honestly, all over the place, and there's no settled consensus. And I assume that this will be a debate that is going to play out in the years to come because there's no real pole around which everyone is gravitating. There's a little centers of power, and they're all competing and arguing with one another. Finally, and perhaps hopefully there may even be some common ground. For those of us who have been critics of the countering violent extremism rubric, there may be some productive ways to work with this administration. I have been worried, and I'm sure you will hear more about this from my panelists, so I don't want to steal their thunder, but I have been worried about the use of this terminology exclusively to apply to Muslims, because you kind of get the fear of Islam through the back door. You're tacitly saying that Muslims are a proto-threat when your only outreach to that community is described in terms of countering violent extremism. I have advocated for a much more pared-down approach where the government gets out of this outreach business. If there's a crime being committed, they go after the crime on its own terms, and it's not framed as part of a larger effort to counter terrorism. There are actually folks in the administration who have come in with the president who see the problem in the same terms. They want to jettison the language. They're not sure what to replace it with, but they also want to get the United States out of the business of doing Muslim community outreach for the purposes of counterterrorism. And I think maybe there's a productive conversation there to be had. Thank you.